I want to welcome everybody to the Murray City Council special meeting. We're glad you are viewing our discussion. Because of the current health pandemic, we're in order to comply with the governor's directive to stay safe and stay home and the public health order issued by the county health department and county mayor, we have determined that an in-person meeting, including attendance by public and the council, is not practical or prudent. Therefore, this meeting will be held remotely through electronic means. Each person is participating from a separate location. We are totally dependent upon the internet and technology to broadcast this meeting and to ensure that the public has an opportunity to view the proceedings. However, there could be a malfunction, and that's totally out of our control. We don't expect any issues. We want you to be aware of that possibility. All council members are now present. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. I want to thank UAMS for putting this on for us. And with that, I'll turn it over to Blaine.
As you know, I'm Blaine Hackey from the General Manager of the Power Department. I've been looking forward to this meeting for a while. We tried to get this together several months ago, and we had some illness involved. But I appreciate you taking the afternoon off to learn more about this small nuclear. And then you can determine for yourself if this fits into Murray's portfolio. We're blessed with a really good resource mix. We have large federal hydro, we have small hydro, we have gas turbines. We have access to 3 coal-fired plants, Hunter, San Juan, and IPP. We have landfill methane options. We have spot market through UAMPS. We have spot market through our independent sources. And as you know, most recently, we entered into a large-scale solar contract in the Four Corners area. So I think it's safe to say that we are the envy of many utilities in the state and the region because of our variety and because of our abundance of resources. But we're always out looking for other things. And so we examine different resources often, in fact, annually. The UAMPS organization brings different resources to our attention. And that's one of the main reasons why we have membership in the UAMPS group, is for them to go out and find some other ways we can better our resources or better our mix. And then we determine in-house whether we like these resources or whether they fit into our mix, and then we will pursue them or not. Several years ago, UAMPS began examining the small modular reactor technology. And this project has morphed into a proposed plant that the world is actually watching. And so here we are talking about small nuclear in little Murray, Utah. And I think we have to ask ourselves, what does this resource bring to the table? What are your concerns? What are our concerns? I think your concerns are my concerns. And I think my concerns are our concerns, and our concerns are UAMPS's concerns. And we can talk about those things. I think it's important to understand the way we manage those concerns is what will sell this plant. I can talk about the advantages and disadvantages of entering into small nuclear. And I could that for quite a while, but I think you can do that yourselves, council members. And I think you can weigh that in your own mind. Several years ago, I brought some nibs, packaged nibs to the city council meeting. And I gave them to some of the council members, and I did it for an intent. My intent was to show you the size of a pellet of uranium, which is about the size of a nib, and the energy content in this small nib. One pellet of uranium, for example, relates to 150 gallons of oil, 1 ton of coal, or 17,000 cubic feet of gas. 5 of these pellets will meet a household needs of its energy for the entire year. So you can see the power in the uranium and the power in the nuclear plant. To give an idea of the footprint, and I think we'll get into that later in the UAMPS part of the presentation, but a wind farm would need 175 square miles of generators to emit the same amount of electricity as this proposed plant we're talking about up in Idaho. I think if you weigh the cost, the efficiency, the reliability, the cleanliness, the safety, the redundancy, and other concerns when we make this decision, I think you'll come to the conclusion that SMR should be on the table there. Just one other tidbit about the cleanliness idea. I found this little bit of information that the city of Amsterdam, Holland, produces 30 tons of nuclear waste a year to produce electricity for their citizens. That's 30 tons of nuclear waste. And a coal plant by comparable energy production for that city would be 300,000 tons of ash. So we can talk about nuclear waste, and we probably will in some of the Q&A you have, but 30 tons of nuclear waste versus 300,000 tons of ash, there's a little bit of disparity there. The reason why we're talking about small nuclear is because some of our contracts are expiring, and we've talked about that before. Even with the new council members, you know about some of the expiring contracts we have. Some of our plants are being shut down. We are in need for a long-term resource. Now, there's no dire need right now. We're not going to run out of power these next couple of years, but I will say that we are short about every month of the year, meaning we don't have enough resources to fit our needs like a glove, especially during the months of July and August. We're deficit. And give me just a couple more minutes, Dale, and then I'll turn it over to the UAMPS group. But we cover our loads through basically 4 base load projects. They are the CRISP resource, which is federal hydro, the Hunter coal plant, the San Juan coal plant, and our landfill. Those are what I consider our base loads. They are reliable. They're on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And we have them on as much as we can because of the cost situation. The rest of our needs throughout other months of the year, we fill with our natural gas turbines, our small hydro, spot market purchases. But we're still about 50 megawatts short during our summer months. Luckily, we have the gas turbines out back that we can turn on. But I'm just trying to show you the need that we do need to buy a resource, a long-term base resource. The San Juan power plant, which is a small sliver of our portfolio, is going to be retired in the year 2022. That's a 1.6 megawatts of Murray's entitlement. And we'll lose that resource forever. We need to replace it. The Hunter power plant out by Price, Utah, we're told will be retired around the year, about 20 years from now, around the year 2040. Hopefully the legislation and politics will stay in mode that we can still run that. And of course, the IPP plant, which is the other coal plant, we're being changed into natural gas on that plant, and we're going to lose about half of our entitlement on that. So these 3 coal-fired plants that we consider our workhorses, our big plants, are being phased out, and we need to replace those. And one more thing, and then I'll turn the time over to the UAMPS group. I think we need to talk about the capacity factor a little bit. The capacity factor is the percentage of a plant or percentage of load that's on. For example, when you turn your light switch on, you hopefully will have power that goes to your light bulb. Any hour of the day, you turn that switch on, you should have power there. My job is to make sure that you have power there and that is an efficient, reliable power plant. So when you turn that switch on, somewhere in Murray or in the region or in the country, there's a power plant that's running that provides power to your light switch, the high schools, the mall, the hospital. But the funny thing about electricity is you can't really store it, and at least economically right now. And we need the base load resources to generate 24/7. Some of the renewables we've looked at don't have a very good capacity factor, we call it. For example, wind is around 25% on, 75% off. Solar, whether it be large scale or rooftop solar, is about 15% on, maybe 30% on, depending on where you are in the country, 15 to 30% on. Hydro is about 40% on because there's a lot of seasonality to hydro. Coal-fired plants are around 70 to 80% on. Gas turbines are fairly flexible, but 40 to 80% on. But nuclear, what they're talking about today, is about 90% on. It has a great capacity factor. It can back up renewables. When the renewables go down, the nuclear comes on. So capacity factor is important when we make a decision on resource. And don't let the pricing of a plant be your sole determining factor, because we need to weigh in all the factors. I hope you find the UAMP's presentation informative. I'm looking forward to it. Please ask them hard questions, easy questions too, but ask them hard questions. We are still hoping to get up to Corvallis near the end of May, if transportation willing. I appreciate your unanimous approach by the council members to go up there and see the tech, see the laboratory up there. Some say that Corvallis and Oregon State campus is the mecca of SMR technology. And we hope to get up there to have you talk to Dr. Reyes and talk to his staff, and so you can get kind of a good feel for this SMR. My job is to bring a resource to the council and the mayor, the administration, and this is just one of the resources that I think we should look at pretty heavily. And so with that, Dale, I'll turn the time back to you, and you can present UAMPS as needed.
Thanks, Blaine. Very good. Very good presentation. We'll turn it over now to UAMPS. I believe it's Mike Squires.
Yes. Baker, our chief. Got the opportunity to come, albeit electronically, in front of you all today. And I understand too, I recognize those council chambers, spent a good number of the youth city council days up there. So I understand and recognize the weight of the decisions that you guys have, and I hope that we can be of service throughout this process, the presentation in the short term, but long term, of course, in working with Blaine, who we thoroughly enjoy working with. We'll just launch into it, and I suppose the best way would be if there are other questions asked along the way. If there, of course, I anticipate we'd have a Q&A afterward as well. And I will avail myself of Mason's intelligence should there be a question that you have for which I have no answer. But with that, let's just get started. So if you could start with the first slide, please. Or next slide, please. Oh, sorry. Thanks. Perfect. So I think everyone at this point on the council has heard of the carbon-free power project and what it consists of. Those three elements, or those three items: renewable energy, enhanced energy efficiency, as well as, of course, what we're here to discuss today, specific to small modular nuclear reactors. Together, these three comprise the Carbon-Free Power Project, or CFPP as I'll refer to during the presentation. Next slide, please. So when Blaine talked about capacity factor and all the other things that any power director or also UAMPS evaluates, we evaluate thoroughly the value proposition of any resource. So as a part of this process that we would apply to any energy resource, we examined the value proposition of SMRs, or small modular nuclear reactors. And I'm just going to run over a couple of these. One, cost competitiveness. We looked at what it would cost to have a baseload power supply with a decent capacity factor. And of course, as far as baseload options go, there was coal, natural gas, or nuclear. The benefit, of course, of nuclear energy is that it is a zero carbon emitting resource. And we figured that the cost needed to, of course, be competitive. Above all, cost considerations, safety considerations, impact on the environment, reliability, are all the things that feed into these things that I'll go over. Notably, of course, the cost we pegged at $55 per megawatt hour, competitive with combined cycle natural gas. We understand too and saw that nuclear energy, or SMRs, provided a flexible and resilient carbon-free resource, like I mentioned. And as Blaine touched on, the ability for SMRs in the way in which they are designed is to be a resource that can quickly ramp. That point is mentioned in a second, but it allows for the integration of more renewables. And that's an issue and a serious consideration that any energy utility or municipally owned electric utility should consider, as we are seeing a higher penetration rate of renewables on the grid. So that is a trend that's only going to get worse, and intermittency of renewables is something that does have to be addressed. We also looked at and have considered too fleet managed operations, partnering with other interested utilities in what we would consider to be a joint operation. And we can talk about that in a little while, but ultimately you'd get economies of scale through better management of a command center that would help work with multiple deployments of SMR technology. And as I mentioned, the renewable issue is something that is growing with regard to what I do on the government affairs side in tracking and studying legislation or regulation. We're seeing an increasing number of states in the absence of federal legislation or regulation on the energy front in a post clean power plan world. A lot of states are pursuing 100% clean energy bills, or some are pursuing very aggressive renewable only standards with combined with carbon-free energy goals. In the 2018 to 2019 session, for example, approximately half of the states in the United States that passed legislation addressing either increasing their renewable portfolio standard or establishing a more aggressive clean energy standard. And just by way of quick definition, clean energy standard would allow for any carbon-free resource, like notably nuclear energy. About half of those who took action, half the states in the United States in 2018 to 2019 cycles, were found in the Intermountain West and the West Coast. So energy is a regional issue. This is something that we feel that UAMPS and other members of the UAMPS organization, of course, need to consider. We also feel that this is a really good market response to any additional federal regulation that could come down the road here. And, none of us could predict COVID-19, and to predict the actions of what could take place in DC, much less in other states, is something that any utility needs to be prepared for. And then, of course, the capacity to, as Blaine mentioned, the capacity factor and the ability to call upon a nuclear energy facility, such as an SMR facility, provides adequacy as far as capacity goes. This last year, nuclear energy through NEI found that nuclear energy plants across the country on averaged a 93.4 capacity factor. So it's clean, carbon-free power that can be called upon 24/7. Next slide, please. So I'm going to spend this slide and the next slide just running over what the plan is for those who perhaps have not yet seen some of the physical dimensions of the plant. The idea being, of course, that these SMRs, a big difference between SMRs and traditional nuclear energy facilities is the way in which the modules themselves, as you see to the left, will be factory fabricated. Of course, that presents great opportunities for economies of scale through subsequent nth-of-a-kind deployments throughout the country, but also throughout the world. Ideally, of course, these modules will be factory manufactured and then assembled on site. And you can see the configuration that we have envisioned is that of a 12 module unit configuration with 6 modular units that you can see on one side. That's showing 5, but 1 is outside of the bay and 6 on the other side. The plant configuration would look very much like a typical big box store, like a Walmart. And if you could skip to the next slide, that will show you a better perspective of what that plant looks like in detail. So this plant, I think, is the actual configuration of the plant would house, of course, the reactor building that you see there indicated in the center, as well as the turbine buildings. You have, of course, the dry cask storage of spent fuel that would be stored on site in a heavily regulated environment per NRC regulations. And I think the most notable thing of what an SMR provides and this plan itself is it's configured and how it will be configured is the size of the actual area. So it would sit on 34.5 acres. And to give you just a quick perspective, UAMPS operates a wind farm based out of Idaho. And that wind farm sits on 17,000 acres. And as Blaine mentioned, and thank you for citing the capacity factor for wind, Blaine, that facility has a maximum capacity, nameplate generating capacity of approximately 57 megawatts. So you look at the size, the footprint, the land use of a wind farm versus the land use of a small modular facility such as this that would have a nameplate capacity of 720 megawatts. The ability to call upon that power as well 24/7 does present a really, I think, stark contrast to the value proposition that we've been very impressed with and find to be very promising for UAMPS members. Go to the next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, cost competitiveness, safety, environmental impact, these are some of the things we evaluate. And I just wanted to touch on, of course, safety. That's one of the biggest concerns, of course, anyone, when we start talking about nuclear energy facilities, has. And again, the SMR design stands out in this regard as well. It has a passive features as to how it would be able to cool down without, as it mentions there right above underneath that arrow, no pumps, no additional power, and no external water. And no additional human input, I would add as well. So gives you sort of the timeline as to the cooling and the enhanced safety features of that design. And that is showing, for just clarification, one modular unit and the way in which the features of the SMR design would provide for maximum safety. This, I will indicate as well, has provided the Nuclear Regulatory Commission with a fair degree of confidence as the design certification process moves forward to limit the emergency planning zone of an SMR plant versus larger nuclear facilities. Again, reassuring UAMPS and UAMPS members of the inherent safety features according to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Next slide, please. And again, feel free to stop. So one of course, the biggest things that we are asked about and is on everyone's mind and is chief amongst all of the things that we are working on when it relates to cost and safety is the NRC licensing process. So there are two tracks, I guess would be the best way of describing this. First, the NuScale would need to, of course, have its design certification application approved. And what that would mean, the DC part, I'm discussing the SDA part, I'll talk about in a second. That would include a very rigorous, highly regulated, highly monitored and evaluated process where NuScale has submitted a design certification application that the NRC is in the process of reviewing. And that process is on schedule, as that third bullet indicates, to be completed by the end of 2020. Now, what that means is once the NRC has approved the design certification, that allows essentially a stamp of approval that design has now been certified for production. But there are additional steps. So one of those, of course, is the standard design approval that's been discussed before and brought up by UAMPS and others. And the standard design approval is something that would permit the design certification that the NRC will license to be in effect the capacity to be improved or to be augmented. So the design certification that NuScale submitted was for 50 megawatts per modular unit. Our plant is envisioned 60 megawatts per modular unit. Through the standard design approval process, NuScale would be able to submit to the NRC an SDAA, Standard Design Approval Application, that would allow it to enhance its capabilities by that 10 megawatts and be approved in effect by the same regulatory body, the NRC. The SDA is anticipated to be submitted by the end of by quarter 2021, or quarter 4 rather, I think. And that presents options too as far as additional deployment. And like I mentioned before, we as UAMPS understand the risk, and we are constantly working to ensure that risk is mitigated along with cost. If you could go back to that previous slide real fast, I just wanted to touch on UAMPS is also then submitting, once the design certification has been approved and NuScale has moved forward with its SDAA, UAMPS will pursue combined operating license application to the NRC. That will be happening mid-2023. Thank you. Next slide, please. So how are we able to get to that $55 per megawatt hour is another question, of course. And one thing I think is of interest, of course, is the support that this project receives from the Department of Energy. But for that support, we would not be at that $55 cost point. And it's important to understand how these arrangements have worked. So UAMPS does have an existing cost sharing arrangement with the Department of Energy, as it indicates, through 2024. And we continue to pursue other opportunities, of course, on the appropriations, the federal appropriations front. But we continue to work with DOE on additional cost sharing support through the commercial operation date. And that process is ongoing, of course, subject as all of this to continued federal appropriations through Congress. But that has been a really valued partnership as this plant has come into being and the project has moved forward. Part of that is the JUMP, the Joint Use Modular Plant Program. And as that indicates, this is a program that's been popular by members of Congress who have continued to appropriate money for that project. Of course, this involves a power purchase agreement with INL, where the plant would be situated, and essentially, as part of the JUMP program, one modular unit, the plant would be leased back to INL to study for further R&D purposes. The second modular unit would be leased back to DOE as far as providing the INL lab its own source of power. And that would come, as mentioned, through a power purchase agreement. Of course, we're working with DOE on site support and providing additional site characterization work up at the INL site. And of course, NuScale is the recipient of also a cost share award from which we also benefit as UAMPS. So of course, this is a project that does require federally appropriated funds. I think the important thing to realize, and I'll discuss this in a later slide in a second, is the fact that this is growing in popularity. As members of Congress, most of whom I'm working with and interacting with their staffs on a regular basis, from both political parties and from both chambers, both the Senate and the House, see value in this. Both candidates now presently now that former Vice President Biden has been presumed to be the nominee, has included SMRs as part of his climate change plan and goals. President Obama supported SMRs. President Trump has supported the continuation of this project through his Department of Energy. So this is receiving support. So yes, while this does need to have continued support, the support for this is growing. So if you go to the next slide, please. This just illustrates the phased development approach that UAMPS has taken. Again, all this is to mitigate risk and with an eye looking toward the costs, of course, for members and, of course, for your residents. So this has taken, we have taken these measures to phase in the development approach, looking at and learning from actively other nuclear energy facilities that have been built throughout the country's history. At each phase, there will be off-ramps. At each phase, there's options. Each participant, as it says on that second bullet, has a unilateral right to exit the project at the end of each phase. Budgets for each phase will be approved by the project management committee or the Carbon-Free Power Project committee within the UAMPS membership. And then each governing board or legislative body would have the opportunity for cities to approve before moving to construction. And what this does is this is essentially provided checks and balances is I'd like to refer to it in the governmental sense, but a really good way of overseeing that the project is moving forward as is needed, and that the ECT is mentioned on that first bullet, the economic competitivity test, is met. And an ECT essentially is an estimation of its ability to be at that $55 per megawatt hour. So those are things that UAMPS staff is constantly reviewing. Members are privy to as far as the conversations we have regularly and at board meetings. And we feel that this is a very sound approach as far as protecting the financial interests of the members, all of whom we serve, and also to ensure that the project moves forward successfully. So next slide, please. So this is the current status of the phased development approach. As many of you know, there was an off-ramp for participants in 2019, so last fall. All the participants elected to stay in the project to keep their output allocation. There have been the, the prioritization of securing DOE support through the CFPP. That's something that I work on, as well as Mason. But from the appropriation standpoint, as I mentioned, that's a large component to this project's success. And I will get to the approach side on it in a second. But the other thing that we have been quite pleased to explore and to thoroughly study, and I can't reiterate that enough, to thoroughly evaluate the cooling decision. And the cooling decision refers to, of course, how those modular units would be cooled. And of course, that requires water. The question is how much. And so UAMPS took a very thorough approach to evaluating how the modular units would be cooled. And we looked at a wet method, a dry cooling method. The dry cooling method has proven to be very positive, and that decision was made to pursue the dry cooling method at the most recent meeting. And that would result in a higher, or less rather, I was going to say higher usage, but a less water intense usage for the overall plant. That again is, I think, a really interesting milestone for us, as well as we talk about its environmental impact. Water has always been a question, and we're doing our best to ensure that not only is it sustainable and from both the environmental standpoint, but it would not impact the overall functioning of the plant. So other near-term work involves finalizing the contracts between UAMPS, NuScale, and Fluor, working on a shared services model, as I mentioned earlier. This gets at subsequent deployments, and there are interested parties and interested utilities. The interest nationwide is growing for this technology. So UAMPS is looking at how can we optimize a shared services model and relying on the expertise of other utilities, people who have gone through the licensing process before, that provides added value to the project overall in making it more efficient and more cost effective. As I mentioned before, shared services we anticipate could result in a $5 per megawatt hour savings. That's something we continue to look at. Also, pre-engagement with the NRC is something that's critically important at this time. We have benefited from working with NewScale and the experts that they have that we'll continue to work with, but also independently, the pre-engagement that I know Mason is engaged on with the NRC is of inherent value as this process moves forward to ensure that the licensing process moves quickly but thoroughly and as needed to ensure that the oversight and proper oversight, both on the government side, but also on the UAMPS side is performed. And I want to just touch then on the last point as the owners engineers that UAMPS has employed. And those engineering firms are critical. And I want to reiterate the fact that with every step along this process and every phase into which we move, the owners, engineers, and engineering firms that we have are independently examining every component of this project, and that's an important thing that I think is really important to understand. There are a number of eyes, a number of qualified people who've gone through this process before that are consistently reviewing what we are doing to make sure that we are doing this in a very thorough way. Next slide, please. So lastly, this is something I just think is also important and perhaps could have been discussed in the last slide when I was discussing DOE support. But you'll see on that table appropriations since fiscal year 2017. And I think the biggest thing to note there is see where the House and Senate marks, and by mark I mean where they initially had wanted to allocate funds, has not only grown, but it's become more consistent across the board. Resulting in the most recent appropriations of $100 million across the board in both chambers. I think that's indicative of the bicameral support that we're experiencing in Congress. House Democrats have introduced the Nuclear Energy Leadership Act, which is a critical part of the success for us to have a public or a power purchase agreement with DOE. But that bill, I want to reiterate, has had Democratic sponsors in the House, where obviously Democrats control, and Republican sponsors in the Senate, where Republicans control. And it's been a very bipartisan piece of legislation. If you look at all the things that we've been able to move forward on, we've done so in a very bipartisan way. And I think that's critical as we experience a lot of political volatility in DC at this time. Further, I just thought I'd touch on too, the state in which obviously this plant will be sited has consistently shown the project a lot of support and is excited for the project. I was just talking to a legislator about this. They're very excited. The governor's office across multiple administrations has been excited for this project. And we're also seeing that voice through legislation and resolution supporting this both in Utah and Idaho. So we're very pleased to see the support on the government side move forward at a state and federal level as well. And I think that just speaks to the value that they see in this. A lot of members of Congress are closely watching this because of the value it provides on an environmental standpoint, cost effectiveness, but also from a national security standpoint and grid resiliency standpoint as well. So I believe that's the last slide. So if you want to advance to that, and I turn it over to, I guess, the chair, and if you'd like to, I guess, further direct the meeting, I believe Mason and I are available for questions.
Okay, thanks, Mike. We're open for questions. First, I want to thank Mike and Mason and Jackie and Blaine for presenting. Well, Jackie for helping set it up. Let's open up for questions. Does anybody have any questions?
Dale?
Yeah, go ahead,
It's
Diane.
Diane. I have several questions. First of all, my biggest concern is the impact that it's going to have to Murray financially. So what I would like to know is if you would clarify the stages and refundability of the city's future financial commitment at each stage. I'm not real clear on that, and what the timetable and conditions for all future off-ramps. And we plan to keep the information updated and available. I'm not sure where to find that for council members and for our constituents. So that's a big concern of mine. And, I think you all know that. So anyway, if you could be specific about that, the costs and off-ramps and what we have available to us. So either Mike or Mason.
Let's ask if Mason could start with that.
Can folks hear me?
Yeah.
I think I've been unmuted now. Okay. Thanks for the question, Diane. As Mike alluded to, we went through an off-ramp late last year where we approved the budget that we're currently operating under. And there will be another opportunity for an off-ramp, likely sort of mid to late summer of this year. When we look at that off-ramp, it will be approving a subsequent budget. And as part of that process, we'll provide a detailed informational package explaining what the next budget looks like, as well as a recast budget for the project all the way through commercial operation. So that will go through the construction phase of the project. So that revision will have specific budgets for those subsequent phases. So we'll have much more detailed information going out in that briefing package. It will have summaries of the contracts between UAMPS and NewScale and Fluor. It will also describe the Department of Energy support in more detail. We've just been talking to the project management committee about the content of that information package. So I think it's going to address the concerns that you were asking about, but we're happy to take more feedback if there's more specific detail that you would like covered.
Yeah, just basically in November, there was an off-ramp and we weren't even aware of it. So, and Blaine advised us, but I think it was $40,000 that was requested of the city, and there was not a public hearing. It was just, we were just told about it basically, and I'm hoping that won't happen again, that you have something in place that will advise us and that you'll be a little more forthcoming in terms of costs and off-ramps. And at this point, if we were to take an off-ramp, what would the cost be? What would it cost us to do that at this point in the game? Can you be specific about that?
Sure. If I could go to the point you made about having more of an opportunity for a briefing at the city council level before the next off-ramp. That is something, and I should have mentioned that we have been discussing with all the participants, and having more time to have more conversations with the governing bodies. So we think there should be sufficient time built into our schedule. So, that dialogue can happen at the community level. So that is something that we're cognizant of moving forward. I think we're looking at least to have 60 or so days to have that happen. So I wanted you to be aware of that as part of the process and the feedback that we've received and integrated into the process. As far as the specific cost, if Murray were to take an off-ramp at the end of this budgetary period, I'd have to double check the exact numbers on it, but it's specific to their entitlement share, and it is that would be assuming that the rest of the project was moving forward. So there would be a cost responsibility to Murray, and I know we've provided that to Murray, but I'd have to double check that exact number. And if we want to, we can come back to that one, but I know that I've got it somewhere here in my notes.
Mason, while you look for that, can I comment?
Sure.
I think it's important to note that the money that's being expended now for the expiration of this licensing is not out of our pocket yet. If we proceed to go through the construction phase of the project, the cost to this point and beyond up to the construction phase will be built into the loan, I guess, or built into the bond. And so I guess it's fair to say that no money's been expended by Murray yet in a theoretical sense. It's not affecting our budget. And if we continue through to the end, it'll just be part of that $55 per megawatt hour cost.
If I might also, Diane, I believe your statement, we voted on the off-ramp in November, if I remember correctly, and we voted to stay in. The added money was in addition to that. That came later, if I remember correctly.
Right, it was $40,000, and I think we were given 10, I guess Blaine was given 10 days or something that was, to provide the information to the council, and there was not a public process, and that concerns me and still does.
Yeah, but we did vote on the off-ramp, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
And then I have a question real quick. Was that something, and Diane and I had talked about this, but was that something that was UAMPS that didn't do, or was that Doug? Is the mayor there? I don't know if the mayor's there. Is that Doug? Doug, are you representing the mayor?
The mayor is not here. No, he's in another
Okay.
meeting right now.
Well, my question is and I could be totally wrong, but I thought that I didn't think that was a UAMPS deal. I thought that was presented to the city and it came a little later to us. Or am I totally wrong? That was UAMPS that didn't bring it to us that quick.
Well, I think Blaine can answer that question better than I. We put it on the agenda as soon as Blaine made us aware of it.
Brett, we found a little bit of a weakness, I guess, in the original contract we signed, and it, if I'm not mistaken, Jackie, maybe you can help me as well. But it said that we'd have 10 days. City would have 10 days of response after the project committee on the UAMP side made an amendment to the budget or whatever. We had very little time to react on that one. If I remember right, it was close to the middle of October when we received word of that. Brought it to the council first part of November, if I'm not mistaken. We were given very little notice, but I wouldn't blame UAMPS. I think it was just something that slipped through the loophole. And as Mason mentioned, from here on in, that 10-day notice that is now in contract or is going to be watched heavily. And UAMPS is committed to give us more time, and I've committed to give you more time as well. It's something that I think that Go
That
ahead.
was my question. All right. Thank you. Thanks, Doug. Thanks, Blaine. Thanks.
So I have a question. How does our involvement with UAMPS affect I know other cities are participating too, and we're all going to be affected. Our budgets are going to be affected over the coming years, maybe for sure the next year. How does that follow up with UAMPS and our contract with you, and how does that align? And does that push things forward? Are we going to have to be forced to be obligated to put X amount down, even if our budgets are being cut in other areas? How is that going to affect ourselves and other cities moving forward?
Unmuted. Sorry, I needed to be unmuted. Hopefully you can hear me now. So I understand the concern, how it would affect the city of Murray's budget process. And the approach that we've taken with this project is, as we go through the development and the construction, we're not billing the participants. So we're not billing the city of Murray for costs that are incurred. We would only start billing the city of Murray once we go operational. So the $55 a megawatt hour accounts for us doing financing for the development and construction costs, and then billing those costs once the project becomes operational. So it's not going to have a current budgetary impact on the city of Murray.
If I might, it will never have an impact on the budget of Murray. If I'm correct, it will have an impact on the ratepayers that pay for the power through Murray Power. Is that correct?
Yeah, if I could answer that, Dale, yes, you're correct, because obviously the power department is an enterprise fund, and any costs associated with the power department are offset by revenue from rates. So you're correct. The ratepayers of Murray Power would bear the cost of these expenses. I also want to just clarify for Council Member Dominguez that there is no budgetary impact. I'm going back to what Blaine said. There is no budgetary impact to the power department's budget unless the city were to back out or stop moving forward with the project. So there's no cost unless the council votes at the next off-ramp to not go forward. And I think, Mason, that's what you're looking up, is what would that cost be at the next off-ramp that Murray would have to pay if the vote was to not move forward.
Thanks, Doug.
That brings up another question. If other cities decide to get off that off-ramp, will we be obligated to have to pay more at the end of this, or will that rate go up?
I hope y'all can hear me. So if other cities decide to take an off-ramp at the end of this off-ramp, all the remaining participants would assess what that impact would have as far as the project moving forward. It would be a determination at that time, if there, it could result in more cost to Murray, but it'd be very dependent on what those exact circumstances were. It could be a very minimal. You might have a small number of participants leaving, but if it was significant, that would be something that Murray and the remaining participants would want to take a hard look at and make sure that it still made sense to move forward at that time. And that's we've tried to build in a lot of flexibility into the contract. So as cities become aware of whether they're going to withdraw or reduce, they notify the other participants in the project, so that can be accounted for by all the participants, because we don't want to, just go to the end of a budgetary period and all of a sudden become aware of that type of information. The project management committee has a lot of control to assess any event that comes up, whether it's a withdrawal of a participant or new information that impacts the project. And that's something, they meet monthly. So I think there's a lot of accountability to make sure that things are being assessed in a very dynamic fashion.
Thank you.
Similarly, I thought it was November's off ramp, but maybe it was the one before that when Logan took a step back. And I can't remember the language for, is it how many modules that they are buying in for, but that did they take a step back at some point, and was that a time where that responsibility shifted as far as our buy-in, or?
Yes, that's correct. Logan did reduce their entitlement share. That's the term that we use. Yeah, the entitlement share. And all that is what output a participant is receiving from the project. And they did reduce their entitlement share. And that's another example of flexibility within the contracts where, and I think that was a question that was raised, is the contracts do have the flexibility for a participant to increase or decrease their entitlement share at the end of a budgetary phase, and that's what Logan did.
And so when cities do change their entitlement share, is that similar to cities dropping out as far as the budget reassessment and our financial responsibility?
So the way it works is the participant, the city, is responsible for its entitlement share through the end of a budgetary phase. That way, we're not reallocating the cost responsibility of a participant inner phase, if you will. So they're responsible through the end of the phase, and then the adjusted entitlement share would be accounted for in the subsequent budget.
Can I ask another question? This might seem like a little out of left field, but this is the question I get in my email from residents. And I think Michael understands it as being a Murray kid, is how is this different from Utopia as far as a huge project that we're undertaking as a city and a huge financial, kind of looming eventual bond to be paid off with those. I understand that it's paid off differently, but what would your response to those residents be of explaining what a different project it is or a different financial situation? I hope that makes sense.
Sure, and I can't profess to be fully up to speed on how Utopia was set up. So I can maybe speak from the perspective of how we've structured the project. So we have the checks and balances. So we're really mindful on the cost before we make a subsequent decision to proceed with incurring more costs by approving a subsequent budget in the project. And I, from what I understand about Utopia, I don't think that they had the type of phased development approach where we're going to spend the next, really 5 years refining the project cost estimate before we make a final decision to proceed to go to construction. And there are lots of opportunities between now and then to reassess the project. And at each of those steps along the way, we'll take a hard look at the project and do that with the support of our owner's engineer groups. We have 2 of them. And I think that's, from the UAMP staff perspective, I think that's critical, that we have that independent help who's helping us along the way. I don't think from what I understand of Utopia, they didn't have that sort of external help, really providing second set of eyes, looking at things. I just think it's a very measured process that we're doing, and I don't think Utopia went about things that way as far as I understood it.
Mr. Chair, if I could speak.
Yes, go ahead.
I may be the only one here that was around when Utopia originally started out, so this is just my opinion. But I think I agree with what Mason just said, that one of the problems that Utopia had was that they did not systematically phase in their project. They went out and spent they bonded for $185 million and went out and built a $185 million infrastructure without having customers. And I think even today, if you were to ask Utopia, how would you do it over again? They would say that they would phase it in. In other words, they would not spend all the money up front. They would systematically make sure they had the subscription basis before they built the infrastructure. And I think the second problem with Utopia is that they overestimated the percentage of people that would initially subscribe. And so instead of getting a 30% take rate, they were initially experiencing only 10 to 15% take rates. So they did not have the revenue coming in to cover their costs. So in my mind, again, just my opinion, the difference really has to do with how we approach this. And if it's approached as UAMPS is approaching this project with on and off ramps, they're not spending all of the money up front. They're not committing to long-term commitments up front. They come in phases. I think that's the biggest difference.
Well, if I might also, the customer base is already here for this power. The infrastructure is already here for this power. And correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't there an off-ramp if the power cost reaches a certain level? There's an off-ramp for that as well. So we're guaranteed a power cost, if I'm correct.
You're still muted.
Am I muted?
No, I think Mason's still on mute.
Oh.
At least I can't hear him.
Okay, I've been unmuted now. I was just going to say, yes, you're correct. That's what Mike was referring to in the economic competitiveness test. That's the process by which we have the arrangement with NewScale, where if we exceed the $55 price target, then we have the opportunity to terminate the project, and then we get a percentage of our development costs reimbursed from NewScale. That percentage declines the longer we proceed with the development of the project, and the rationale behind that is as we move forward to final notice to proceed to construction, we have further de-risked the project, so we should have more cost certainty as we get closer to that decision point.
Mason, it's Diane. I'm wondering also, I don't think you answered my question about where we can find when the off-ramps and the costs and, how we're going to know in advance what the costs are and when we're going to have, do you have any kind of schedule for that, or how does that work?
So how it works, Diane, is we go through the process of revising what we refer to as the budget and plan of finance. And that's the document that has the cost estimates for each phase of the project. And we went through the process of revising that at the end of November. That revision was specific to this budgetary period that we're in. And we focused just on this budgetary period that we're in. But the next revision will incorporate a full revision to all the subsequent phases for the project. And I think that's what you're looking for, is being able to see not just the next budget, but the budget after that and what the exposure would be to Murray. And that's the intent of the next budget. And that'd be part of the informational package that we would be sending out and giving the city more time to work through at the city level. So, you weren't getting things with that 10-day window that you described earlier.
And when would that be available? When would we be receiving that?
Yeah. Well, the key items for us to get resolved is we've been working with the Department of Energy on getting in place a longer term award for the project that would carry that award going through the whole construction phase as well. So as soon as we get that finalized, then we're going to proceed with putting together that information package. We're hopeful that that happens very soon. Within the next month or so, would start getting that information and working on that informational package. And that's the gating item. It's not going to be that we send the information package and then we wouldn't provide the participants with ample time to review them and go through any dialogue you want to have at the community level. I'm not trying to be vague on it. I'm just trying to explain that, that's the necessary step before we send out the information to the communities.
Mr. Chair, can I ask a question?
Please.
So Mason, I think where Diane's coming from, and I'm going to ask it in a different way. When this project started originally, UAM and provided a spreadsheet showing approximate costs to move forward from off-ramp to off-ramp. Mm-hmm. I remember seeing that spreadsheet, and I'm sure that's what Diane's referring to as well. And as I remember, to move forward with the project, and I'm throwing out estimate numbers that just off the top of my head, I could be wrong, and Blaine might be able to clarify this because I've heard Blaine also explain it. It seemed like it was a small cost initially to move forward with the original agreement, something like $10,000. Now, Murray didn't have to pay that, but it went into our bank account, or it went against our bank account. And then when we got to the first off-ramp, which was in December, as Member Turner indicated, there was a cost of about $40,000 that went against our bank account at that point. And as I remember, the next off-ramp that we have coming up later in the summer or whenever it hits, it was when the big numbers start to hit. So if we, as I remember, it was like $800,000 for us if we got off at the next off-ramp. So I think that spreadsheet is really what we're all remembering. Mm-hmm. And I remember they were just estimates, but I think that's, if I'm understanding what you're saying, Diane, is that what you're looking for?
Yes, it is something more specific. We got it initially, but I'm sure things have changed. I know they have. And so I would like to have it updated so we have some sense of what our commitment's going to be, when our off ramps are going to be, and what it would cost us should we choose to take the off ramp. So yeah, I thought that's what I had said, but maybe I wasn't clear enough.
Well, yes, and I apologize if I wasn't clear. That information would be detailed in the information package. Yeah, so we would be providing that same look with the latest refinements to it.
Let me go back in my memory bank here. When we initially got in the project, we were only 1 megawatt. And I believe our initial investment you might say, was around $15,000. And then we increased our entitlement to 10 megawatts. And I wish I had that worksheet in front of me. It was around $240,000 was our commitment to get to the first off-ramp, which was last fall. And then we asked for the other 40 some odd thousand for the study. So to answer your question, Diane, to my recollection, we're about $280,000 into this. We walked away. Now, I don't have that worksheet in front of me, but that's my recollection. And Doug is right. The next off-ramp was a bigger one, and I believe he's right. The number I've seen is around $800,000 was for the next off-ramp. And then the very next off-ramp, which was a couple years later, that was the big one. That was the 7-8 million or something like that. So to answer your question, Diane, I believe we are about $280,000 into a commitment right now. Hope that helps.
It does. And I had a sense of that, but I wasn't sure. And that's why I was hoping that UAMPS would help clarify that. Also, this is pretty new. I mean, it's this whole thing with small nuclears. It's a new application of an old technology, and we really don't know what's going to end up happening. So when you talk about the external, not using external water, the safety issues and things, it's really all speculation. That also concerns me, that this is brand new. And, I'm concerned about having us involved in it. So, and I've expressed that before. But.
Diane, I think in my first comments today, your concerns are our concerns. Our concerns are UAMP's concerns. They're asking the same questions I think you are, as far as water usage and that. We're kind of going down this alone, and you're right. This is the virgin plant. But I think we're taking a very methodical approach, a slow approach on doing this. And the good part about this is we're first out of the chute, we get the $55. Second out of the chute, it could be in the $100 range. If you got to juggle those and weigh the options of, do you want to do it now or do you want to do it later? And the UAMPS approach is let's be first out the chute.
Okay.
Can I ask another question? So this might be for more for Blaine. So sorry, I'm trying to read the notes that I took as everyone was talking to make sure I get it right. So we're talking that we're short on power once, going forward, when the coal plants have to shut down, California is moving clean. Sorry, I'm kind of just hopping through it. So you said that we're going to be short. So the power that we do sell, and that's without the nuclear, just where we're at now. If we didn't sell to California, would we have enough? You've talked about we have that callback ability. Would that give us enough power for our summers where we're hitting our peak?
The way it works, Kat, is that if we have surplus or if we're deficit, the UAMPS pool, in their bigger pool of 40 cities, kind of take care of that for us. For example, on today, if we order too much, it goes into a pool, and then Logan might approach it and say, hey, we'll buy that out of the pool. We are selling some to California, and that is part of our landfill, methane. They needed some renewable, and landfill methane generation is renewable, but they needed the REC. They needed the REC or the green tag attached to the kilowatt hour. I know it's kind of complex, but they didn't want just any old kilowatt hour. They wanted a kilowatt hour that was made green. And we had to sell them a green attached kilowatt hour. We sell, I'm trying to think, about 3 megawatts to California. It's the Truckee Donner Group. And that's through the UAMPS organization. That's not enough to cover our 10 megawatt. We'd still be deficit. But we could call that back and help out a little bit. But that's an expensive resource. We're talking that landfill right now is about 15% more expensive than the nuclear we're talking about. It's in the $65, $70 range. We're talking about a $55 resource. Does that help?
Okay. That's very helpful. So we'd be calling back about 3 when, what would you say we'd be short otherwise?
Well, there are some months when we're short 50 in the middle of summer. I'm not worried about that because we have our generation out back.
Okay.
And there are months like April and May right now, we're not that short, maybe 7 or 8 megawatts.
Okay.
But we like to play the market on that. We don't.
Yeah.
I could be $65.
I'm not against selling it. I'm trying to tick through the box of the most frequent questions I get about it. And that was a really simple way to explain it back. So thank you.
Okay.
So I have a question that comes up quite a bit as well, is how is this, and this is my second kind of informational meeting with UAMPS, but how is this technology different than what already exists in other areas of the United States? And what are the safety features? I know we talked about it a little bit, but if you could just, someone from UAMPS explain it, or someone from the body, where it makes sense to residents without being inundated with so much information, just kind of like a quick 2-3 sentences of how is this different and how will this be different?
I don't know if anyone's trying to talk. So in a quick way, the way in which it's you're looking specifically for how is it different in the safety aspect, right?
Safety, and how is it different from other plants that already exist in the United States? Like I know that there's one in Arizona that produces power as well. I get a lot of information about different power plant sites, different nuclear sites, and then reports of people being injured on these sites or deaths that have happened. And that has come up. That's been a really big concern for residents, and that we're even involved in this, especially with my constituents. So that's something that always comes up. It's just, how is this project different?
Certainly. By virtue of the technology that NuScale has developed, they have a lot of safety features and passive safety features, as you can see right there. So typically, as you may have heard of Fukushima incident in Japan, they lost power to the reactors, which means they couldn't run the pumps and keep the reactor cool. That's just a very quick summary. So having access to additional power has always been an issue. So when you can alleviate that, and you can also, like is expressed in that slide there, no longer require additional AC/DC power, and that the passive, the nature of the way in which the plant is designed, those modular units, and using just physics in the way in which it was designed, doesn't require additional AC/DC power, does not require additional water as well, or human input. They're walk-away safe. And when we say walk-away safe, that's because, you wouldn't need additional operators to ensure that cooled down. Now, of course, it takes a timeline. You can see the timeline, of course, that it takes to cool down. But those are inherent safety features that are distinct from your typical plant. So because of that, we also have a smaller emergency planning zone. The emergency planning zone refers to the radius of area that would be required for a plant to ensure that there wasn't people living right next to the plant, that there would be an evacuation zone. So it's probably the easiest way of looking at it. Safety zone, and some plants require a much larger emergency planning zone to the tune of miles, a couple miles. This plant, because of this, the NRC has found, because of its safety features, such as the ones I've just described, the emergency planning zone would be much smaller, limited to the actual fence line of the plant. And the way in which they would be manufactured is inherently different. Of course, that gets to the big difference between traditional nuclear plants throughout the country that have been one-off designs. Getting a design certification application approved through NRC for NuScale and this technology, it's anticipated, of course, that would facilitate the fabrication of these offsite and impact the cost, making it more affordable to manufacture these in mass at a facility that's highly controlled, of course, and then assemble them on site, which would make them cheaper to manufacture, as well as the variability, the customization of being able to customize the overall balance of plant to have 1 or 2 or 6 or 12 different modular units to customize the need to the demand. Of course, we envision that the way we are setting this up maximizes the value from an economic standpoint to have the 12 modular units. But those are some things that are distinct and different from normal plants, that I think also gets to its ability for the NRC to facilitate the licensing procedure for those who would like to seek a combined operating license in the future. So those are a few things. I don't know if there's other specific ones, like Mason, if I forgot one, or Blaine, if I forgot something, let me know or chime in.
Mike, one of the big questions I think that citizens will have, and I heard other organizations like Hill, Utah, and others bring up has to do with the waste, the radioactive waste. And, we have this because of the movies, probably 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, and, all these visions of these radioactive rods that have to be taken out to Dugway and transported along our highways and freeways. Can you talk a little bit about how this technology deals with waste, and what kind of waste has to be dealt with from this plant?
Sure. This plant would use normal enriched uranium as is used in other reactors. There are advanced models that would require high assay enriched uranium. This plant doesn't. That means ultimately really nothing in the sense of how much waste would actually be generated. Spent fuel will be necessarily generated, and in this country we obviously do not reprocess for a number of different reasons. Reprocessing gets at the in effect recycling of the spent fuel. But per NRC regulation, right now it's the policy that there'd be on-site storage. And I indicated on that diagram of the plant, there's the dry casts into which the spent fuel would be placed and stored on site. And that raises a real question long-term, right? Because of all the politics that has surrounded Yucca Mountain and establishing a long-term storage site facility, as was established or was held out to be the goal since 1985. Unfortunately, that's, I think, ultimately going to be stalled indefinitely, at least when I look at what's taking place in Congress right now. There's a growing interest because of the on-site storage situation right now, that members of Congress are feeling more pressure from not only the nuclear energy industry, but also their own constituents to find some solution that does not involve on-site storage. UAMPS supports two bills that are currently in Congress. One definitely is bipartisan. It's been co-sponsored by Senator Feinstein and Senator Alexander, and it would set up a consent-based siting framework where you would have interim sites throughout the country. And that's something that we support and we are continuing to monitor because of the real need, right, long term to have a strategy. But it is my recollection, and Mason, please correct me if I'm incorrect, that the spent fuel that would be generated by that facility, by the SMR configuration, the CFPP would be able to fit within the plant, overall plant design, as far as where the dry cask storage would be. But is that accurate?
Yes, I believe that on site within the fence line, we have storage capabilities for up to, it's either 40 years or maybe up to 60 years of operations.
Okay, thank you. We've been going for about an hour and a half. Should we take a couple more questions and then wind it up? Are there more questions?
I have another question, if you don't mind.
Oh, go ahead, Diane.
I'm just curious. You say small nuclears. So, what are the dimensions? How big are they? When you talk about small SMRs, small nuclears. So about how big are they? And they're about 12 of them. Is that, or am I misspeaking?
Diane, if we can get up to Corvallis, you can see one actually, not a real one, but they're around 60 feet tall, around 20 feet round, approximately, the cask type. And basically they come in 2 or 3 pieces to the site, and then they will put them together. And there's 12 of those. That's one module. And that'll be around 60 megawatts in that one. So it'll be 12 of those. So they're around 65 feet tall, 15, 20 feet around, generally. Is that right, guys? UAMPS?
Thank you, Blaine. I just wanted to have some sense of how big these small things are, because I know the nuclear is huge, but anyway. So.
Well, when we say small, I mean, it's 700 megawatts for a small nuclear, which is the 12 combined modules we have. That's small compared to the big nuclear plants with the big concrete funnels and those types of things. Those are the thousands of megawatts. Ours is around 700. So it's all relative to the size, but to have a module that's only 60 megawatts, that's about half of Murray. I mean, it's big, but it's manipulative. You can move it around. You can be flexible with the load, with actually cranking the generator up and down on it. You can manipulate a little bit faster.
And this has never been done before. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, Diane. This would be the first of a kind deployment.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate your information, and I'd like more of it. So.
Okay, the last question I'll take. Will either Blaine or somebody from UAMPS explain why we need generated power to go along with renewables like wind and solar? We need to generate the power, in my understanding, to be able to push that power through the transmission lines. Is that correct? Some form of it. Don't everybody jump on at once.
I was waiting for Blaine to jump in first, but I can jump in. From the UAM's perspective and sort of the way we've been approaching this as the CFPP as a resource as part of our larger decarbonization efforts. When we look at the most cost effective to go about providing decarbonization options for our members, we think this resource fits really well within a portfolio that's deeply saturated with renewables. We remain committed to continuing to bring options to the members like Red Mesa. We're particularly keen on solar right now because it's a little easier to forecast than wind, which tends to be more variable. As we know, renewables are intermittent, and Blaine alluded to it. The modular nature of these reactors allow us to deal with that flexible generation where we can ramp. We might have one reactor of the 12 that was just really focused on integrating in renewables, where we could deal with fluctuations associated with renewables going up and down. That's a really attractive feature for us. Right now, the typical way of dealing with that intermittency of renewable generation is through natural gas generation. And that obviously has carbon emissions associated with it. So for us, as we look at this resource, it fits a really good niche as we look at a future of decarbonized electric generation where it can act as a baseload resource, but then it also has that flexible ability to ramp up and down with renewable generation.
And Mason, you're exactly right. To answer the question, on a smaller scale, because Murray is small scale compared to the UAMS group, but in a typical summer load, we will buy our power. But that top part where people are turning their air conditioners on and off, we will control with the governor of the natural gas turbine. And I think that's what we're going to do with these nuclear modules is as the renewables go on and off because of sun or wind or snow or whatever, we'll physically move the governor up and down on the small modulars, similar to what Murray does with the natural gas turbines. And big coal-fired plants can't move that fast, and other resources can't move that fast. But in the case of natural gas, and theoretically in the case of the nuclear, we'll be able to react pretty fast, and that's going to save lots of money if you can react fast.
Okay, thank you. I lied to everybody. We have 2 questions online. Jennifer, could you read those?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So a couple of the questions, one of them is from Mary Paul, who is a resident. And her comment is, I'm a resident and appreciate considering new and innovative options. However, I distinctly oppose nuclear energy at this stage of development. We simply can't properly dispose of the byproducts. Nuclear waste only becomes hotter over time. Have serious considerations ever been given to geothermal? I don't know if you just want to have that on the record as a question or if you're wanting to respond to that.
Does anybody have a response to that or know the response? I'm not an expert, but I'm not sure we have geothermal around here.
Dale, the response I would take from Murray's perspective is there are some places for geothermal. That is one of the resources that UAMPS Group has looked in the past. Down by Cove Fort, there's a geothermal plant. I think out in the Vernal Basin, there's a plant out there. At one time, Provo City Power had the geothermal plant down in Cove Fort area. Found out it was, this is years ago, maybe the technology's changed, but they found out that it was very caustic and very hard maintenance-wise to keep it going, the piping and such. I think the plant is still going down there, but it's no longer a Provo. We're not opposed to looking at that. We aren't. we like I said, anything that comes down the hopper, we'll look at. But in the past, the financial part of it just hasn't come through on the geothermal part.
Okay, thanks, Blaine. Jennifer?
So the next question, how much money has Murray spent on this to date? That's from Alan Newman.
My recollection is we have spent $0, but I know what he means by the question. We've committed to, I believe, $280,000. I'd like to get that number in the council's hands. I don't have the worksheet in front of me. But when we upped our commitment from 1 megawatt to 10 megawatts, our commitment went up proportionally, of course. I believe we're about let's round it to $300,000 so far. And if we proceed through the end of the project, that will be built into the rate structure near the end of the project when it goes to construction. Let me make one more comment. I don't want to belittle the fact of $300,000, but we make power deals on the day basis here on the spot market that moves $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 with just a flick of the mouse. I'm not belittling the fact that $300,000 is not a lot of money, because it is. But in our utility perspective, to put money like that out towards a resource that might pay 40 years worth of dividends is small change in the long run.
Thanks, Blaine. Are there any others, Jennifer?
There are, but I'm seeing that there's a common theme in here. So I'm going to kind of combine these. I think what the concern I'm seeing is disposal. So, and Doug had touched on this a little bit in his comments, but people are asking about how we're going to dispose of the waste, and if there are contingency plans for earthquakes and pandemics like what we're facing now. There was a comment that there was an understanding that depleted uranium is less radioactive than natural uranium. And if we can address the toxicity and radiation dangers of depleted uranium, how it is stored and recycled.
And Mike, you touched on that a little bit. You want to go back to the storage?
It's NRC policy that the spent fuel would be stored on site. So this on-site storage would occur at the site in Idaho at the Idaho National Lab. I was trying to jot down and keep track of what the chain of questions was, but as far as the waste disposal, that's what would occur. Like I mentioned, that right now we're still supportive of legislation and finding a long-term storage solution for the country's nuclear fuel storage at large. I do think it's worth noting too, as far as the amount, as Blaine had referred to in the beginning, as far as cost value or value proposition of any fuel source, coal ash and coal ash ponds generate, span a much larger area than spent fuel. And the spent fuel is, like I mentioned, secured in dry cast with a number of different protections that have been taken into place to ensure that it be done in a heavily regulated environment, so as to secure that plant against incidents like an earthquake or like a natural disaster. And as it relates to the question about an earthquake, it's part of the site characterization work that we're performing up at the lab, where this will be cited as an intense seismic analysis, a number of different reviews, from vulcanization to any other thing that could impact the actual integrity of the plant itself, but also how it interacts with the surroundings as well, from water quality, et cetera. So the process by which this is getting licensed does take into account a lot of those, and that's because of how heavily regulated this industry is per per the NRC guidance and regulations that exist.
Okay, thanks, Mike. And with that, I want to thank everybody for taking part in this meeting. I think we had some good information here, and we'll continue to stay as informed as possible as this process moves forward. And with that, I'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you.